German and Japanese chef's knives are two of the most common knives you'll find in kitchens around the world. What's so great about these two different styles of chef's knives is that although they do have their own unique characteristics, they do share similar features that make their functionality in a kitchen near identical. Now, what makes things really interesting is that within each of the knife categories, we'll call them, from German to Japanese, each style can then have their own different features and characteristics. For example, if you look at these two classic Zwilling and Wusthof German chef's knives, at a glance it might be very similar, but if you look at the bolster and the curvature of the tip of the blade, these are very different knives and can be used for different things in a kitchen. The same goes for the Japanese chef's knife or the Gyuto. Both of these are technically Gyuto knives, but this has a Kritsuke tip or a K-tip. Meanwhile, if you look at these two, you can see how the curvature at the tip of the spine is a little bit different. So whether you're doing research and shopping for your very first chef's knife, or you're looking to add another to your collection, be sure to stay tuned because I am going to dive in deep in the differences and the similarities of not just German to Japanese chef knives, but German to German and Japanese to Japanese. And then to add another layer, we're going to talk about the hybrid German-Japanese style knives that basically blend the best of both worlds. Just being totally honest, chances are by the end of this video, you're really going to want one of each. And if that's the case, awesome. But I have a feeling you're going to at least be able to narrow it down to one that's best for you. What's up, y'all? I'm Chef Brandon with Cutlery and More, and I have been collecting knives for well over a decade. I've got over 114, I think, in my collection as of today, many of which, as you can see, are different types of German and Japanese chef's knives. From my very first chef's knife that I ever got to some of the more recent Japanese chef's knives that I've added to my collection, over the years, I have figured out which characteristics are best for certain cutting techniques like tap, push, rock chop, etc. So in this video, I'm going to break it down into three different sections. First, we're going to explain the traditional characteristics of German chef's knives and then Japanese chef's knives. Then, instead of showing you all their differences side by side, I'm going to put these knives to work so you can see them in action cutting various types of ingredients. And that's where you're really going to understand that the curvature of this classic Zwilling Pro is a lot different than, say, this Kritsuke Gyuto or this hybrid Zwilling with the Damascus blade. And by the end of this, you're going to be able to think about the types of cutting techniques that you're most comfortable with, look at how these knives are being put to work, and then just align them together so you can pick out which is going to be best for you. All right, we're going to get started with a brief history lesson here. A lot of people wonder which came first. Now, although the Europeans and the Japanese have been making knives for a very, very long time, and swords and a bunch of other weapons, the classic chef's knife, this style, which led to this, got started back in 1731 when the Zwilling trademark was established, which basically became the first brand that standardized what is the chef's knife. And here we are a couple hundred years later, and we've still got nearly the identical design from back in the 1700s. Let's fast forward to the mid to the end of the 1800s when Japan was modernized and westernized and started adding beef into their diet, which became a staple to their cuisine. Well, most of their knives were designed for vegetables and fish, not meat. So they needed a knife that was better for butchering cows as well as slicing meat. And that is what inspired the Japanese chef's knife, or the Gyuto, which translates to cow blade or cow sword. I mean, you can't have much more of a specific name for a knife than that. Beef played a major impact on the development of these Gyuto knives. Since the Germans did it first, we'll get started with the traditional characteristics of the German chef's knife. We'll start with the length, which is honestly the same for German, Japanese, and even the hybridized knives, which range generally between 8 to 10 inches, but they can go as low as 6 inches and upwards of 12. However, when I hold a 6-inch blade, based off of my personal experience, to me, this feels more like a utility knife. And then when I'm holding a 12-inch chef's knife, sometimes it's leaning into the carving knife or slicing type of knife category. For the most part, think of a chef's knife between 8 to 10 inches long. German chef's knives are made with softer stainless steel. Now, the stainless steel is great because it minimizes staining and rusting. Remember, it's called stainless, not stain proof. So can you rust a blade like this? Yes, which is why after every time you're done using it, you should hand dry it, and please don't put any of these knives in the dishwasher. A German blade is usually sharpened between 14 and 20 degrees. That combined with the softer steel makes maintaining the knife a lot easier. So honing it to help maintain the edge, as well as sharpening these knives, it's a lot more forgiving compared to the harder Japanese steel. So regardless of the type of sharpener that you're using, and there's a ton out there, you have a lot more wiggle room with the softer German blade. The handle and the bolster. When I say bolster in this video, I'm referring to this area of the knife. There's some nuance involved when discussing bolster, but we're basically talking about where the blade meets the handle. So this is the bolster area. In this case of this classic Wusthof, this is a full bolster. And you can see how the metal is wide all the way to the heel of the blade. Now, compared to the Zwilling, you can see that the bolster tapers off and then the blade goes all the way down to the heel. So it is as sharp here as it is here. Whereas with the Wusthof, this is not sharp at all. German knives have a full tang handle, and what that means is that the spine and the metal of the blade goes all the way down into the handle, all the way to the butt of the knife, and then the handle is added to each side. The benefit of a knife with a bolster as well as the full tang handle is you can see they are really nicely balanced when you are at the very base of the blade, which is where you're supposed to grip. Your 2 fingers pinch the very base of the blade, your other 3 fingers wrap around, and if I go like this, you can see that they are primarily balanced right there at the base of the blade or the tip of your grip. But that can easily change when we're dealing with a shorter 6-inch blade knife. You can see this just wants to kind of come back to the handle, whereas an 8-inch blade, a little bit heavy in the handle as well. So the longer the blade of a German knife, the better balance that you will have. And finally, let's talk about blade shape. As you can see, both of these knives have a slight difference in curvature at the very tip of the blade. The Zwilling Pro has a little bit of a straighter spine, and it just has a subtle curve. And then the belly of the blade, where it starts to curve, starts way back here, and that has a really nice curvature that goes up towards the spine. And as you can see, the tip of the knife is meeting much closer to the spine. In a little bit, when I start cutting up product, you're gonna see how that curvature and this straighter spine is great for 2 particular types of cutting techniques. Now, if you look at this Wusthof, which Zwilling has the exact same type of knife as well with that type of bolster, but what you'll notice is that there's a little bit more of a downward curvature at the tip of the spine and a softer belly curve from the edge, and the tip of the knife meets closer to the center of the blade. And yes, there are benefits to a knife with this shape, which we'll get into when we start tap chopping. Now let's get into Japanese chef's knives, or the Gyuto. The first thing, I already mentioned this, is the length. They're generally gonna fall between 8 to 10 inches, but you will find some that are a little shorter and a little longer. Japanese knives are made with high carbon steel, which is much harder than the stainless steel of German chef's knives. And the edge is a bit more narrow. It's generally between 10 and 14 degrees. So this part of the knife is going to be thinner than a lot of the German blades. Now, if properly maintained and honed, this harder steel knife will hold its edge longer than the German knives, but they are a lot more challenging to sharpen. Not only is the steel harder, but the angle of which you are sharpening the knife is completely different as well. We always recommend having your Japanese knives professionally sharpened, or learn how to use a whetstone, which really is the only type of sharpener that you should use for Japanese knives. The finishing of a Japanese blade deserves a video all on its own because there's so much detail to discuss. For now, let's just explain it as this. A lot of these knives have different layers of textures of finishing. So anywhere from polish to this matte type of feel and texture to a hammered texture, which kind of does what the hollows on the side of a Santoku knife do, minimizes food from sticking. Then you can have other blades that are completely polished all the way through and hammered. And then of course you have the Damascus steel, which has different layers of different types of steel put together. And this is one of the strongest, sturdiest blades that are ever made. Something that's really important to understand is that this knife is going to be a lot easier to maintain than this knife. So there's a level of responsibility that you need to consider. Are you going to throw this in the dishwasher? Which it will survive. We don't recommend it. Are you going to dry this after each use, not have it sit out dirty, and be sure that you polish the blade as well as the handle? You got to consider these things when you're looking to invest in any of these knives. You definitely need to take care of them, but especially some of the higher end hand-forged Japanese knives that develop a patina. And I don't mean to say this to scare you or deter you away from any of the Japanese knives. I just want you to know what you're in for when you're buying a new knife. The German stainless softer steel, it's a lot easier to maintain. If you leave this out dirty on your cutting board for a while, you don't dry it, or someone accidentally puts it in the dishwasher, honestly, you're gonna be totally fine. But if you do that with some of these Japanese blades, they're gonna look very different the next day after you clean them. So just be very mindful that care and maintenance is involved. A little less on the German side, quite a bit more on the Japanese side. As you can see, the handle of a Japanese knife is very, very different than the German. Generally, they are octagonal in shape, meaning that they are 8-sided and they fit left and right hands equally. Now, the handles are very different in weight as well because unlike the full tang German knife, the Japanese Gyuto is either a partial or a stick tang, which is basically where the metal here of the very base of the blade that you can see goes down and tapers off either about halfway into the handle or some a little bit further down. What's great about the partial or stick tang octagonal handle of a Japanese knife, it is very lightweight, but it also means that it is going to be blade heavy and the balance is not going to be the same as the German chef's knife. But if you want a better balance, all you have to do is choke up on the blade a little bit with your pinch. Now, there's this common misconception with knives that for whatever reason, they have to be perfectly balanced right at the bolster or right at the base of the blade. But as I showed you earlier, a shorter German knife is not going to be balanced that way. That's a 6-inch. This is an 8-inch. I'm going to have to come way back on the handle to get that where it needs to be. The reality is it's completely up to you. It's personal preference. It depends on the cutting techniques that you like to use. It also depends on how long are you using the knife at once. You know, working in a commercial kitchen, you might want a lighter blade if you're doing prep work for 2 or 3 hours before you actually have to start cooking. But if you're at home and you're only prepping for about 10 or 15, 20 minutes, the heavier handle might be good for you. It's also going to depend on how you're using the tip of the blade. If you're doing a lot of intricate cuts or positioning the knife on angles in different ways, the lighter Japanese handle might be best for you. And finally, let's talk about blade shape. And as you can see, each of these is very different. Let's get started though with the blade shape that would be closest to the Wusthof, which is how a lot of the German knives are shaped. As you can see, the tip of both of these knives meets closer to the center of the blade. The Gyuto has a little bit more pronounced curve at the tip here compared to the Wusthof because the Wusthof curvature starts way back, even to here. It starts tapering, whereas the Gyuto is almost about here. So in the sense of the tip of the blade of these two knives, they are very similar. Now let's compare two different Gyutos. As you can see, the curvature of the spine is much more pronounced in this knife, and the tip ends up landing closer to the edge of the knife. These two knives for the rock chop or cross chop or mincing position will feel very different, just as these two German chef's knives will feel different as well. And I'm gonna get into all that in a little bit once we start getting these knives to work. Now, unlike the German chef's knives, which are for the most part going to fit into the shapes that I showed you, the Japanese knives take it to a whole other level by adding a K-tip or a Kuritsuke type of tip to the Gyuto knife. As you can see, this almost has a reverse tanto type of shape to it, similar to a bunka. And both of these knives have very, very different shapes to the tip, as well as the width of the knife as it goes down. This has a much more pronounced spine angle compared to this one. And with these knives, you're going to find that doing intricate work with the tip of the knife is absolutely amazing. But when it comes to, say, the rock chop or mincing, sometimes you will see that the tip of the knife likes to dig into the cutting board, which is like nails on a chalkboard for knife lovers. Again, there's a variety of shapes among the family of German chef's knives and definitely the family of Japanese chef's knives. So now it's time to put these knives to work so you can see them in action. And as you're watching me cut up these different ingredients, I want you to think about how you are currently using your knives at home or working professionally. I also want you to think about how you wish you could use these knives. If you're more of a beginner with your skill set with knives, but you're looking to advance, then you might want to get a knife that pushes your boundaries a little bit. But if you're super comfortable with where you're at, you don't want to go getting a Kuritsuke Gyuto when you should be getting a classic Wusthof. So pay attention to how I'm using these knives and visualize yourself using them at home. Let's get started with the tap chop, which is where you are going in a more straight up and down motion pretty rapidly into the product. Onions, doing a julienne is one of the most common ways to do this. The reality is any of these knives, even the short 6-inch chef's knife by Wusthof, is going to be totally fine for this style, as you can see. Now you notice how I'm using the middle of the knife. Most tap chopping, that's what you're doing. You're using the middle. If it's a real firm product, you can use the base, and we'll talk about using the tip in just a moment here. That is the Zwilling Pro. Now let's get a little piece of shallot here with the small one. We've got the Yoshikane. And now the Mac with hollows, which is a hybrid. The classic Global, that's somewhat of a hybrid, but also has a very unique design compared to a lot of Japanese knives. And now a much larger Gyuto with the K-tip or Kuritsuke Gyuto. Tap chopping with the middle to the base of the knife. If that's what you're comfortable with, any one of these knives will do the trick. Now let's talk about tap chopping with the tip of the blade. This is the Zwilling Pro, my first chef's knife. It's absolutely amazing. I have used and abused this for many years. However, when it comes to tap chopping with the tip of the knife, as you can see, I don't have a lot of surface contact because of this hard curve to the belly of. So if you are comfortable tap chopping with the tip of a knife, then what I would recommend is going with a German knife or a Gyuto that has the tip more centered to the blade. So for some garlic here, this is the Wusthof Classic. Now you can see even some of these, no, they pretty much came apart totally fine. Now the Gyuto here has a little bit flatter of an edge than the Wusthof. You can even hear the difference in that steel. and the thinness of the blade. It really is a night and day difference. I'm gonna be totally honest with you. I love it. The Kuritsuke, the K-tip Gyuto works great with the tip. And now we have this hybrid knife, German style handle, full tang with the Damascus steel. This is the Zwilling Tanrei. Now you see the angle of my wrist. Now watch what happens, how much higher it goes to be able to use the tip of a knife with that type of curvature to the blade. Even in my video here, I am wiping down these blades because I want to keep them looking good and lasting a long time. When I'm cooking at home, I'm constantly, almost between every single ingredient, giving them a quick wipe down. Just get into the habit of doing this, as well as honing them often as you're using the knives as well. Now let's do the push chop. Honestly, almost every single one of these knives is going to be totally fine for the push chop, depending on the size of the product that you're working with. The shorter knives, not so much, because you don't have much room to really go into the product unless it's really small. For the push chop, again, stick to that 8 to 10 inches, maybe 7 inches, and you'll be good to go. What you're doing here is you are pushing into the product at an angle like so. You generally come back so you're almost towards the tip of the blade, and then you're finishing back towards the heel of the blade. That was the Yoshikane. Now we've got our Zwilling Pro. Generally speaking, with the push chop, you're going a little bit slower, so you have a little bit more control. If you are newer to working with a knife, I recommend perfecting the push chop before you move on to the tap chop. This is the 6-inch, which you can see is totally fine for this push chop. As you can see, we're pushing and slicing at the same time. Smaller product, better for a smaller knife. I had to grab some cabbage, but also my bench scraper because it is just so much easier. And doing this with a bench scraper is a lot better than scraping your blade on your cutting board, which honestly, I do all the time. But if it is something that you like to do, I would not do it with Japanese knives. The fine angle of the edge, the thinner blade, does not like to be scraped or pivoted on. German knives, again, they're much more forgiving with the softer stainless steel, so you can bring them back to life. So keep that in mind in the sense of how you use your knife and how you abuse your knife. Okay, the push chop is great for product that is higher off the cutting board. And for something like this, again, I would want to use a larger blade. So we'll use this polished and hammered Kuritsuke style Gyuto, and you're pushing and slicing at an angle as you go through the product. Now let's check out this Gyuto, which has that real pronounced curve, tip closer to the edge and straighter blade. And if you want to move product around without using the edge, just use the spine of the knife. And we'll finish this up with the Wusthof Classic. Notice how this is a bit higher than it is wider. Just push it down on its side. And now you can finish the product. You can do the same thing with an onion. Mise en place, everything in its place. Basically, you want to stay organized. When you're done prepping something, even if you've got a giant cutting board like this, you want to move it off your board and get it into its own container, or go right into the pan to fire and start cooking, or move it into a bowl if you're mixing things together. Keep yourself clean, neat, and organized. This is a work area. It's not a storage area. All right, folks, it's time for the rock chop, which is one of the easiest and safest ways to cut, especially if you are new with knives. Now, I've talked a lot about this hard curve of this Zwilling not being good for certain things. Well, it is stellar when it comes to rock chopping. Rock chopping, or the European style cut, is basically where the tip of the knife stays on the cutting board at all times, and then you are rocking back and forth in a circular motion. You can see it from a different angle, right here. This is great for many different types of products, especially those that are a bit firmer, like carrots, whether it's a baby carrot or a horse carrot. Really, the big difference is going to be how high off the cutting board you're coming. You are planting the knife on the front between your first and second knuckle, your thumb is tucked behind, you're pinching the base of the blade, and you are just going to rock and roll and glide down the product. At the end, sometimes you need to have more of an up and down motion, which is totally fine to make sure you get relatively even cuts. I'll do another one with the Zwilling here because you can see how awesome this blade is and the flow and the rhythm that it gets into in this rock chop European style position is amazing. Next up, we've got the Wusthof Classic, which doesn't have as pronounced of a curvature at the tip, but as you can see, does an amazing job at the rock chop. Okay, now let's look at a Gyuto. I have one on one end of the spectrum and another that has that tip that's similar to the Wusthof. This Gyuto, with this curvature to the blade, normally for the rock chop would not work very well. However, since this is a very long knife coming in at over 9 inches, you got more leverage. So when it comes to the rock chop, completely different feel than the German, but it is still totally possible to do without the tip of the knife digging into the cutting board like what would happen with the K-tip Kuritsuke Gyuto or another knife like, say, a Bunka. Now, the shorter Gyuto here that has that more centered tip is similar to the Wusthof, and this flows very nicely. Again, a very different feel because of the lighter handle compared to the German style blades. I would say, just across the board, if you are much more comfortable with the rock chop and you don't intend on tippy tapping or anything like that, the balanced weight and the heavier handle of the German style blades is much better for the rock chop. But if you want to have that hybrid approach of the Japanese steel and that heavier weight, then you could get something like this Mac here. And you get the best of both worlds. Slicing, very simple. Generally, when you're slicing, you're using more of the tip of the blade, and you're going to be at different angles depending on the product that you're using. Any one of these knives is great for slicing. When I slice, I like to do it in 2 quick motions, forward and back, forward and back. That is our Zwilling Pro. This is the more pronounced downward curve of the spine of a Gyuto. We've got this little 6-incher, which is okay for this lemon, but with larger product, you generally want a larger knife when you are slicing. A Kuritsuke, not a problem, right on through it. The tomato, the nemesis of dull knives, right on through. This is the Zwilling Tanrei. We've got the Wusthof Classic, which I need. Okay, see that? I need to sharpen this knife. It's worked well for other things, but that did not cut that tomato immediately. That's a dull knife. I should be ashamed of myself. I haven't used this one in quite some time. So let's go right over to the Kuritsuke style Gyuto. Let's check out the little 6-incher here by Wusthof. Oh yeah, that one's doing all right. The Yoshikane. Woo! Right on through. Again, when it comes to slicing, the only thing I would say is regardless of the style of knife, you just want to have a longer knife for larger product. For example, my pork loin from last night, which I love making and cutting thin that I can use for sandwiches and a variety of other things like on a salad or in a wrap or something like that. The longer the blade, the better it's going to be. You start towards the tip, you push, you pull, push, pull. You don't want to be sawing at the product like this. Instead, you want to do a clean push and pull. Push and pull. Push, pull. Let's go over to the Cutlery style Gyuto. Push, pull. Push, pull. The Damascus Zwilling. Sometimes a little bit more of a saw motion. Otherwise, you got to put a lot of force into it. So personally, I prefer a longer blade when cutting wider, larger products like a pork loin, slicing a brisket up, anything like that. Now, if you do a couple little things like that, it's not the end of the world. You're still getting a thin cut, but you want to try to do the push, pull. Ooh. Oh no. Caught that live, folks. Cleaning my knives. Just completely bent the edge of the tip. It's like boop. I don't even know if you can see that close up. You can hear it grip. Or I can feel it grip. Whew. Here's the thing. This is a softer German stainless steel knife. So I know that I'm going to be able to work that out on a coarser stone and then sharpen on a finer stone with a whetstone. Or I'm going to send it in to get sharpened elsewhere, like, at Cutlery and More. Now, had I done this to a Japanese harder steel knife, there's a good chance that the tip would have broke off completely. It's crazy. So again, mistakes happen like you just saw there. So I know that I can easily fix this. I can fix it, or I can have someone else. But when it comes to a Japanese steel blade, that tip would be completely redesigned and have to be like reshaped at the entire tip there instead of just kind of like straightening this out. So something to be mindful of. Things happen. Gosh, my Wusthof is dull. Won't cut a tomato. I killed the tip of my Wusthof again. This knife has just been through it today. And last but not least, mincing, or the cross chop, which is like the two-handed rock chop that is going across the cutting board. So you are pinching the base of the blade and the tip of the blade, and you are rocking with your dominant hand to the handle and pivoting. Now, this is the Zwilling with that really nice curvature there, and I'll show you where this is fantastic. Is like when you have bunched up cilantro like this, and you just need to bring it closer to the cutting board. Look at that flow that it has because of that curve. It's already much lower in height. Then you can start going faster. And this just has an amazing bounce to it and balance. Bounce and balance. It's great. Softer steel. You can kind of pivot this a little bit harder. You can put some weight into it. And this knife just is stellar at mincing or cross chopping. Now let's go over to a little bit shorter Gyuto. Again, this has the center tip to the blade and it works. But what I'm doing is I'm doing a couple and I'm moving the knife. I'm not pivoting as hard because I don't want to bend that fine Japanese super sharp edge. And with this, I'm really just letting the weight of the knife do the work. I'm just moving up and letting it kind of come down. I'm not pressing down with a lot of weight. One thing I can say is that if you're doing a lot of mincing, the longer the knife, the better. With a short one, even with a nice curve that would be good for this, you just don't get a lot of product cut at once, and it's kind of hard to grip the tip. Now, the Cutlery style Gyuto with this hard angle at the tip here is really not the best because your fingers slide down. You don't have enough to get a hold of. And if you pinch up higher, it's just awkward. It doesn't feel right. And the other thing with a longer knife is your hands are more spaced out evenly to kind of where your elbows are versus choking up on that blade or coming in with this one where it's not a natural flow with your elbows, your shoulders, your arms. You just kind of feel out of alignment with a shorter blade when you're doing the cross chop or mincing. So again, if you're super comfortable with cross chopping and rock chopping, looking for a knife that has a nice curve like this Zwilling Pro or pretty much any of the other German style chef's knives or a hybrid that has a decent curvature to it, but steer clear from the knives that have a more pronounced downward curve at the spine where the tip meets closer to the edge, unless it is much longer like this Gyuto. Notice how I'm doing again, less pivoting, it's more a reset. I do a little pivot and reset. That is going to save the edge of this super fine Japanese blade. All right, folks, so keep in mind that there are plenty of other ways to use a chef's knife, whether that be German or Japanese, and in different positions, primarily when it comes to filleting or butchering, or even breaking down a watermelon where you're using the knife at different angles. All these things need to be considered when you are thinking about a chef's knife. One thing I just must say to keep in mind is that if you are using the knife in more intricate ways, deboning a chicken or filleting a fish, one of the things that I can certainly say that makes life a lot easier is having a knife that does have a very pronounced tip. Even if it's towards the spine side of the blade or more centered, you just got to make sure you have something that has a really nice tip. Now, I'm going to wrap up here with a couple of hybrid knives or knives that I haven't shown you just so you can see the variety. I've already put the Global and the Mac to work. Global is a great company. I recommend the 8-inch Global for anyone who has smaller hands or just wants something that's really lightweight, and you get the benefit of having a Japanese style blade with the thinness and the angle of the edge, but you get that polished finish that is really easy to maintain. The Mac is a bit of a hybrid as well because you get that German style handle with the hollows with this design to help minimize sticking, and of course the Japanese style blade. One thing I can say with the Mac is make sure that you are drying this after each use. I have two Enso knives here. One has various layers of Damascus, another is Damascus into a hammered finish. Both of these chef's knives are great. They have a very lightweight handle, although they're more full-bodied in feel compared to some of the more traditional octagonal shaped handles of the Japanese knives. This is the Wusthof Performer, which has a full bolster, a really nice balance to it, and a really awesome grippy handle. If you're in food service or you're prepping a lot, this is awesome for just making sure you are not going to be sliding around, and it just looks awesome. I keep saying awesome about this knife because it is. I love the finish. I love the feel. Great knife. Now we're going to bring a little French into the conversation. This is a K Sabatier, which is designed off of the German style French knives. This has a very similar Gyuto type of tip, super lightweight. Again, you've got the full bolster, and the balance on this is a little bit handle heavy, but this is a fantastic knife for everyday prep and also some more intricate cuts just because of the size and the width or the height of the blade. The Wusthof Ikon, I showed you the 6-inch. This is the 8-inch, all around great all-purpose knife. As you can see, the bolster isn't quite as full as the other Wusthof. So the blade, the edge goes all the way down to the heel, but it still has a really comfortable fit. The balance is closer to the handle, so handle heavy. Again, for those enjoying that rock chop and the cross chop, this might be a great knife to look into. You've got a relatively centered, more spine leaning tip, and it's just, again, a great, great knife. And last but not least, we have another hybrid, which gives you the Japanese style blade with the more German style full-bodied handle with a pretty nice balance, as you can see there. This has that more pronounced curvature towards the tip of the spine with the centered tip, and this is just another fantastic feeling knife. So with all these knives that you've seen today in my hand, in action, being put to use in different ways for different cutting techniques, I hope you're able to think about how you use a knife so that you're able to visualize yourself tap chopping with the tip, doing the rock chop, mincing, the cross chop, slicing, all of it. That way you can confidently decide which type of knife is best for you, whether that be the classic Zwilling Pro all the way back to the 1700s, or the more traditional Gyuto with the varying levels of polish and finish and high carbon steel. But regardless of which one you go with, these are all forever knives. They are knives that if you take care of, you will have for a very long time, if not forever, and pass on to your kids or friends or other family members. All right, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. I know this was a longer video, but for those who stuck around, I hope you learned what you needed so that you can confidently choose which knife you are getting next. Take care.